The gunshot shattered the early morning calm, sending a flock of startled birds scattering into the pale Wyoming sky. Bethany O'Malley ducked instinctively, her heart hammering against her ribs as she pressed herself against the weathered exterior of Dawson's General Store. She'd only been in Cottonwood Springs for 3 days, and already she'd witnessed more violence than in her entire 22 years back in Boston. It was 1878, and the promise of a teaching position at the newly established schoolhouse had drawn her west. The romanticized tales of frontier life in the dime novels she'd secretly devoured had painted a far different picture than the harsh reality she now faced. "Stay down, madam," a gravelly voice commanded from somewhere to her left. Bethany turned to see a tall figure moving with surprising stealth for his size, a Winchester rifle held with practiced ease in his calloused hands. His face was partially obscured by the shadow cast by his wide-brimmed Stetson, but she could make out the hard line of his jaw, stubbled with several days' worth of beard. Another shot rang out, this one splintering the wooden post just inches from where Bethany stood. She stifled a scream, pressing her hand against her mouth. "I said stay down," the man repeated, his voice somehow both harsh and calm. In one fluid motion, he grabbed her arm and pulled her behind a water trough as another bullet whizzed by. "What's happening?" Bethany managed to ask, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to appear composed. "Trouble," was his only reply, as he aimed his rifle and fired a single shot down the street. A pained shout confirmed his accuracy. The exchange of gunfire continued for what felt like hours but was likely only minutes. Finally, the sound of retreating hoofbeats signaled the end of the confrontation. "They're gone," the man said, finally lowering his rifle. He turned to face her fully, and Bethany got her first clear look at her protector. His eyes were the color of a storm-dark sky, set in a face weathered by sun and wind. A thin scar ran from his right temple to the corner of his mouth, giving him a perpetually grim expression. He wasn't handsome in the traditional sense, but there was something undeniably compelling about him. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over her with clinical detachment. "No, I don't think so," Bethany stammered, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look, her carefully pinned hair now falling in copper waves around her shoulders. "Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Heath Hawkins," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "And you'd be the new schoolteacher." It wasn't a question. In a town as small as Cottonwood Springs, news traveled faster than tumbleweeds in a windstorm. "Yes, Bethany O'Malley." She extended her hand, remembering her manners despite the circumstances. "I'm pleased to make your acquaintance, Mr. Hawkins, though I wish it were under different circumstances." Heath looked at her outstretched hand for a moment, as if uncertain what to do with it, before briefly clasping it with his own. His touch was rough but surprisingly gentle. "You shouldn't be out alone," he said, already turning away. "Town's not safe these days." "I was only going to the mercantile for supplies," Bethany explained, brushing dust from her skirts. "For the schoolhouse." Heath nodded once, his expression unreadable. "I'll see you safely there." As they walked the short distance to the mercantile, Bethany was acutely aware of the curious glances from townsfolk peering out windows and from behind partially closed doors. "Are those men likely to return?" she asked, trying to keep pace with Heath's long strides. "Could be. They're Wiley Barton's men. Been causing trouble since the railroad announced plans to run tracks through the county. And you? What's your part in all this?" Heath glanced down at her, something like surprise flickering across his features. "I'm just a rancher, madam. Got land northwest of town." "A rancher who handles a rifle like a seasoned soldier," Bethany observed. The corner of his mouth twitched, almost forming a smile. "War teaches a man things he'd rather not know." They reached the mercantile, and Heath held the door open for her. The owner, Walter Dawson, looked up from his ledger, his eyebrows shooting up in surprise at the sight of them. "Miss O'Malley, we heard the commotion. Are you all right?" Walter hurried around the counter, his round face creased with concern. "I'm fine, Mr. Dawson, thanks to Mr. Hawkins." Walter's gaze shifted to Heath, his expression changing from concern to something more complex. "Hawkins, didn't expect to see you in town today." Heath nodded curtly. "Wasn't planning on it." An awkward silence fell, and Bethany sensed a history between the two men that she wasn't privy to. "Well," she said brightly, "I should get what I came for. The children start classes on Monday, and there's still so much to prepare." Of course," Walter said, his jovial demeanor returning. "I set aside those primers you asked about, and Mrs. Dawson added some decorations for the schoolroom no charge." As Bethany gathered her supplies, she couldn't help noticing that Heath remained by the door, his posture tense, eyes constantly scanning the street through the window. There was something almost predatory about his vigilance. When she'd finished her business and had her parcels wrapped, Heath stepped forward. "I'll carry those." "That's not necessary," Bethany began, but he'd already taken the packages from her arms. "I'll see you back to the schoolhouse," he said, in a tone that brooked no argument. Outside, the town had returned to its normal rhythm, though Bethany noticed people giving Heath a wide berth as they passed. Some nodded respectfully, others averted their eyes altogether. "You're not very popular, are you, Mr. Hawkins?" Bethany observed as they walked toward the small clapboard building that served as both schoolhouse and her living quarters. Heath's stride didn't falter. "Don't much care for popularity, clearly, but you do care about something, or you wouldn't have risked your life to protect a stranger this morning." This time Heath did pause, giving her a long, measuring look. "You ask a lot of questions, Miss O'Malley. I'm a teacher. It's in my nature." She met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated. After a moment, he nodded, as if coming to some internal decision. "I care about justice. This town's seen too little of it lately." They continued walking, and Bethany sensed there was more to the story than he was telling. "Is that why you intervened today? For justice?" Heath's jaw tightened. "Wiley Barton and his men have been terrorizing this county for months. Sheriffs either too scared or too corrupt to stop them. Someone has to. And that someone is you?" They'd reached the schoolhouse, and Heath set her packages down on the porch. "It's complicated, Miss O'Malley. Please, call me Bethany." He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "You should be careful here. This isn't Boston. The West has its own rules." "I'm learning that," Bethany said softly. "Thank you again, Mr. Hawkins. Perhaps I'll see you at church on Sunday." Something like amusement flickered in his eyes. "I'm not much for church, Miss O'Malley." "Bethany," she corrected him. "Bethany," he repeated, and something in the way he said her name sent an unexpected warmth through her. Then, with a tip of his hat, he was gone, striding down the dusty street toward where his horse was hitched. Bethany watched him go, intrigued despite herself by the enigma that was Heath Hawkins. There was a story there. She was certain, one written in the hard lines of his face and the shadows in his eyes. And despite her better judgment, she found herself wanting to know more. The schoolhouse bell rang clear and bright in the crisp morning air as Bethany welcomed her students for their first day of lessons. 15 children of varying ages filed into the one-room schoolhouse, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension as they regarded their new teacher. "Good morning, children," Bethany said warmly. "I'm Miss O'Malley, and I'm very pleased to meet each of you." As she led them through introductions and began assessing their various levels of education, Bethany couldn't help glancing occasionally toward the window. She told herself she was simply admiring the beautiful Wyoming landscape, but if she were honest, part of her was looking for a glimpse of Heath Hawkins. She hadn't seen him since the shooting incident 3 days ago, though she'd heard plenty about him from the town gossips. According to Mrs. Dawson, who'd stopped by with a welcome basket, Heath had been a Confederate cavalry officer during the war. He'd come west afterward, like so many restless veterans, and established a modest cattle ranch outside town. "Keeps to himself, that one?" Mrs. Dawson had said, her voice lowered conspiratorially. "Lost his wife and baby daughter to fever 5 years back. Some say that's what turned his heart to stone." The story had struck Bethany deeply. She understood loss. Her own parents had died within months of each other when she was 19, leaving her to fend for herself in a world that offered few opportunities for unmarried women. Perhaps that's why she felt drawn to the taciturn rancher. They were both survivors in their own ways. At midday, as the children ate their lunches in the schoolyard, Bethany noticed a rider approaching from the north. Her heart quickened as she recognized Heath's distinctive silhouette. He rode a magnificent black stallion, sitting easy in the saddle with the natural grace of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback. He dismounted at the edge of the schoolyard, tipping his hat politely to a few of the older girls who giggled and whispered behind their hands. Ignoring their reaction, he made his way toward Bethany. "Miss O'Malley," he greeted her, his voice as rough as she remembered. "Mr. Hawkins, what a pleasant surprise." He shifted uncomfortably, as if unused to social niceties. "Wanted to make sure you weren't having any trouble after what happened the other day." Bethany smiled. "That's very thoughtful of you. We're doing fine. First day of school is always a bit chaotic, but the children seem eager to learn." Heath nodded, his gaze moving over the schoolyard with the same alertness she'd noticed before, as if he were constantly expecting danger. "Actually," Bethany continued, "I was hoping to visit some of the outlying families this weekend. There are several children who should be attending school but aren't on my roster." Heath's expression darkened. "Not a good idea for you to be riding out alone." "I'm quite capable." "It's not about capability," he interrupted. "Barton's men are still out there, and they're not the only danger." Bethany crossed her arms, feeling a flash of irritation at his presumption. "Then perhaps you could accompany me, Mr. Hawkins, since you're so concerned for my welfare." She'd meant it as a challenge, not expecting him to accept. To her surprise, Heath nodded after only a brief hesitation. "Saturday," he said. "I'll come for you at dawn. The Prescott place is a good 2-hour ride." Before Bethany could respond, one of the younger boys came running up, his face tear-streaked. "Miss O'Malley, Jimmy says my ma can't read, 'cause she's stupid." Heath took a step back, clearly uncomfortable with the child's distress. "I'll leave you to your duties," he said, already turning away. "Saturday, then?" Bethany called after him, receiving only a raised hand in acknowledgement as he strode back to his horse. She watched him ride away, wondering what she'd gotten herself into. There was something dangerous about Heath Hawkins, not just in the way he handled a gun, but in the way he made her feel both unsettled and intrigued. Saturday arrived with a spectacular sunrise that painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson. Bethany was ready when Heath arrived, dressed in her most practical riding skirt and a sturdy jacket against the morning chill. "You ride?" Heath asked, eyeing the outfit. "Since I was a girl," Bethany confirmed. "My father believed in practical education for both his children." Something like approval flickered in Heath's eyes as he helped her mount the gentle mare that Walter Dawson had arranged for her use. His hands were strong and sure at her waist, lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. They rode in companionable silence for the first mile, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional call of a meadowlark. Eventually, Bethany's curiosity got the better of her. "How long have you lived in Wyoming territory, Mr. Hawkins?" 7 years," he replied. And it's Heath. Heath, she amended with a smile. What brought you here specifically? He was quiet for so long that Bethany thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, After the war, I couldn't go back to Virginia. Too many ghosts. Came west looking for something I couldn't name. And did you find it? Heath glanced at her, his expression softening slightly. Found peace for a time. Until you lost your family, Bethany said gently, immediately regretting the words when she saw his face close up like a shutter. Who told you about that? His voice was cold enough to frost the morning air. Mrs. Dawson mentioned it. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. No, you shouldn't have. Heath urged his horse ahead, effectively ending the conversation. Bethany sighed, berating herself for her tactlessness. They rode in strained silence for another mile before Heath suddenly raised his hand, signaling her to stop. What is it? She whispered, alarmed by the tension in his posture. Riders. Coming fast. He pointed to a dust cloud in the distance. Could be nothing. Could be trouble. Without waiting for her response, he led them off the trail into a stand of cottonwoods near a small creek. They dismounted, and Heath tied their horses securely before positioning himself at the edge of the trees, rifle at the ready. Stay behind me, he instructed, his voice taut with concentration. Bethany did as she was told, her heart racing as the sound of approaching horses grew louder. Through the branches, she could make out 3 riders pushing their mounts hard, heading toward town. Barton's men, Heath muttered, his finger hovering near the trigger. How can you tell? The one in front is Silas Reed, Barton's right hand. The riders thundered past their hiding place without slowing, apparently unaware of their presence. Bethany released the breath she'd been holding, only to gasp when Heath suddenly grabbed her arm, pulling her further into the shelter of the trees. What, 2 more, coming slower? He whispered, his mouth close to her ear. Looking for something, or someone. Sure enough, 2 additional riders appeared, moving at a more deliberate pace, their eyes scanning the landscape. One of them reined in near the spot where Heath and Bethany had left the trail, studying the ground. Tracks, the man called to his companion. Fresh ones. Heath's grip on his rifle tightened. If they follow us in here, I'll have to take them down. You mean kill them? Bethany whispered, horrified. If necessary. The tracker dismounted, examining the hoofprints more closely. For a tense moment, Bethany was certain he would follow their trail into the trees. Then, unexpectedly, a gunshot echoed from the direction of town, followed by several more in rapid succession. The 2 men exchanged glances before the tracker remounted hastily. Forget it. Sounds like the boys started without us, he said, and they galloped away toward the commotion. Heath waited a full 5 minutes before he relaxed his vigilance. They're gone, but we need to get back to town. Something's happening. The school, Bethany began, suddenly frantic at the thought of danger reaching her students. It's Saturday, Heath reminded her. No one's there, but we still need to go back. As they rode toward Cottonwood Springs at a pace that made Bethany's teeth rattle, she couldn't help noticing the change in Heath. Where before he'd been reserved, now he was focused and alive in a way she hadn't seen before. There was a lethal grace to him that both frightened and fascinated her. They crested a small rise that overlooked the town, and Heath pulled up sharply. Damn, he muttered. Bethany followed his gaze and gasped. Smoke was rising from several buildings, and even from this distance, they could see figures running through the streets. What are they doing? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Making a statement. Heath's expression was grim. Barton wants this land for the railroad. He's showing what happens to those who stand in his way. We have to help. You're staying here, Heath said firmly. I'll go down and assess the situation. I will not stay behind while people might be hurt, Bethany insisted. I have medical training. I can help. They locked eyes in a silent battle of wills. Finally, Heath nodded reluctantly. Stay close to me. Do exactly as I say. And if I tell you to run, you run. Understood. Understood. As they rode into town, the extent of the destruction became clear. The sheriff's office was ablaze, as was the newspaper office. Several storefronts had broken windows, and the saloon's batwing doors hung askew on their hinges. People were emerging cautiously from hiding places, some moving to form bucket brigades to fight the fires. Bethany was relieved to see no bodies in the street, though several men were nursing wounds of varying severity. Looks like Barton's men have moved on, Heath observed, scanning the area with narrowed eyes. Heath! A voice called from the direction of the mercantile. Walter Dawson limped toward them, a makeshift bandage wrapped around his left arm. Thank God you're back. What happened, Walter? Heath dismounted in one fluid motion, helping Bethany down more carefully. Barton's men rode in shooting. Said they had a message from the railroad company: sell now or suffer worse next time. Walter's face was ashen beneath its usual ruddy complexion. They took Sheriff Preston with them when they left. Heath's expression hardened. Any casualties? Old man Jenkins took a bullet to the leg. Doc's with him now. Couple others with minor injuries. Could have been worse. Mr. Dawson, let me look at your arm, Bethany said, stepping forward. As she tended to the wound, a deep graze that needed cleaning more than anything, she half listened to Heath questioning Walter about the raiders. There had been 8 of them, led by Silas Reed. They'd ridden in from the north, fired indiscriminately to create panic, then systematically targeted certain buildings. They said Barton's coming himself next time, Walter finished, wincing as Bethany applied pressure to stop the bleeding. Said he's tired of waiting for the town to see reason. Heath's face was like carved stone. He's not getting this town. Not while I'm breathing. Walter looked up at him, a strange mixture of hope and resignation in his eyes. You can't fight them alone, Heath. There's too many. I won't be alone. Heath's gaze swept the gathering townspeople. It's time Cottonwood Springs stood up for itself. As the day wore on, Bethany worked alongside the town's doctor, treating injuries and helping organize relief efforts for those whose businesses had been damaged. Throughout it all, she was acutely aware of Heath moving through the town, talking quietly with men here and there, his expression intense and focused. By evening, an impromptu town meeting had formed in the undamaged church. Bethany slipped in quietly, taking a seat at the back as Heath stood before the assembled citizens. Most of you know me, he began, his deep voice carrying easily through the room. And most of you know I prefer to keep to myself. But what happened today changes things. He spoke without dramatic flourish, laying out the situation in stark terms. Wiley Barton, backed by railroad money and his own brand of ruthlessness, wanted their land. The sheriff was either complicit or a hostage. Help from territorial authorities would take weeks to arrive if it came at all. We have 3 choices, Heath continued. We can sell out and abandon our homes. We can wait for Barton to return and hope for mercy. Or we can fight. A murmur ran through the crowd. Fighting means risking everything, Heath acknowledged. But surrendering means losing everything for certain. I know what my choice is. Each of you has to make your own. There was a moment of tense silence before Walter Dawson stood, his injured arm in a proper sling now. I'm with you, Heath. This is my home. I won't be driven from it. One by one, others stood: the blacksmith, the barber, the livery stable owner. Even the pastor rose, saying quietly, "There comes a time when turning the other cheek means turning your back on justice." Bethany watched, a lump forming in her throat, as the town united around Heath's leadership. There was something profoundly moving about seeing this solitary man, who by all accounts had withdrawn from human connection, now standing at the center of a community, giving them hope and purpose. When the meeting concluded with plans for defending the town, Bethany waited outside, watching as Heath exchanged final words with several men. When he finally emerged, fatigue was evident in the slump of his shoulders, though his eyes remained alert. "That was remarkable," she said softly as he approached. Heath looked surprised to see her. "What was?" "The way you brought them together. Gave them courage." He shook his head. "Just told them the truth. Sometimes that's the hardest thing to do." Bethany hesitated, then asked, "What happens now?" "Now I get you safely back to the schoolhouse, and tomorrow we prepare for Barton." They walked in silence through the darkened town, the smell of smoke still heavy in the air. When they reached the small, attached quarters where Bethany lived, she turned to face him. "Thank you for today, for protecting me." Heath nodded, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Lock your door. Keep a lamp burning tonight." As he turned to go, Bethany impulsively reached out, catching his sleeve. "Heath, be careful." Something flashed in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, at her concern. For a moment, she thought he might say something more, but he merely nodded again and walked away, his tall figure soon swallowed by the darkness. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Classes were suspended as the schoolhouse was converted into a makeshift armory and planning center. Every able-bodied man in town participated in building barricades and practicing with whatever weapons they possessed. Women prepared bandages and stockpiled food and water, preparing for a siege. Through it all, Heath was everywhere, teaching proper shooting stance to shopkeepers who'd never fired a gun, organizing defensive positions, even riding out on scouting missions to track Barton's movements. Bethany rarely saw him rest, and when she did manage to speak with him, their conversations were brief and focused entirely on preparations. Yet she couldn't help noticing small changes in him. The way he now acknowledged townspeople by name, how he listened patiently to their fears and suggestions, the protective glance he cast her way whenever she entered a room, as if assuring himself of her safety. For days after the raid, Bethany was organizing medical supplies in the schoolhouse when Heath entered, his expression more grave than usual. "Barton's on the move," he said without preamble. "Scouts saw them breaking camp this morning. 20 men, heavily armed." Bethany's hands stilled on the roll of bandages she'd been preparing. "When will they reach us?" "Tomorrow. Mid-morning, likely." Heath moved to the window, staring out at the town that had become an improvised fortress. "I want you to leave, Bethany. There's a stage to Cheyenne at dawn." "Leave?" She set down the bandages, indignation rising within her. "This is my home now, too. These people, these children, are my responsibility." "Your responsibility is to stay alive," Heath countered, turning to face her. The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "What happens tomorrow? It won't be like before. These men won't just fire a few shots and leave. They're coming to take the town or burn it to the ground. All the more reason for everyone who can help to stay," Bethany said firmly. "I'm not leaving, Heath." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his hands gripping her shoulders with surprising gentleness, despite the frustration evident in his face. "Why are you so damn stubborn? Do you know what Barton's men do to women when they raid a town? Do you know what it's like to run away when others need you?" She countered, her voice steady despite their proximity. "I've spent my whole life being proper and cautious, Heath. I came west because I wanted more than that. I wanted to matter." Something shifted in his expression, respect mingling with exasperation. "You matter," he said roughly. "You matter too much to," he broke off, seeming startled by his own words. His hands loosened their grip on her shoulders but didn't fall away entirely. "To what?" Bethany prompted softly, her heart suddenly racing. Heath's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. For a breathtaking moment, she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he stepped back, his hands falling to his sides. "To die needlessly," he finished, his voice once again controlled and distant. "But I can see you've made up your mind. At least promise you'll stay in the infirmary, away from the fighting." Bethany nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "I promise." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. Without looking back, he said quietly, "Be safe, Bethany." The words hung in the air like an unfinished sentence as he walked away. Dawn broke cold and clear on what would later be remembered as the Battle of Cottonwood Springs. Bethany helped establish the infirmary in the church basement, the sturdy stone foundation offering the best protection for the wounded they anticipated. Several of the town's women would assist her, while the older children had been given the task of running messages and supplies. Heath had positioned defenders strategically throughout the town, with the main force concentrated around the northern approach where Barton's men were expected. As Bethany made final preparations in the infirmary, she heard boots on the stairs and turned to find Heath standing in the doorway. He looked different. Gone was the weather-worn rancher's attire, replaced by what she recognized as a military bearing. He wore a gun belt with 2 pistols, a knife sheath strapped to his thigh, and carried his Winchester with the easy familiarity of a man who'd lived by his weapons. "They're coming," he said simply. "Half hour, maybe less." Bethany nodded, smoothing her apron with suddenly nervous hands. "We're ready here." Heath glanced around the well-organized space, approval evident in his expression. Then his eyes returned to her, softer than she'd ever seen them. "I wanted to say," he began, then stopped as if uncertain how to continue. "If things go wrong today—" "They won't," Bethany interrupted, unable to bear the thought of him saying goodbye. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Always so sure. I admire that about you." He took a step closer, his voice dropping. "But if they do, I need you to know that meeting you, it woke something in me I thought was dead." Bethany's breath caught in her throat. "Heath," he shook his head, stopping her words. "Not now. After. If there's an after, we'll talk then." The sound of a warning bell from the church tower cut through the moment. Heath straightened, his face resuming its mask of calm determination. "Stay safe," he said, and was gone before she could respond. The battle began with an eerie silence. From her position in the basement, Bethany could hear nothing at first, only imagine the approach of Barton's men as they entered the seemingly deserted town. Heath's strategy had been to let them advance into the main street before revealing the defenders' positions. Then came the first shots, a crisp volley followed by the chaotic eruption of return fire. Above her, the church floorboards vibrated with the concussion of nearby gunfire. Soon, the first casualties began arriving, a young man with a bullet wound to the shoulder, followed by Walter Dawson with a bloodied face from flying glass. "How goes it up there?" Bethany asked as she cleaned the cuts on Walter's forehead. "Holding our own," Walter replied grimly. "Heath's plan is working so far. Got them boxed in on Main Street, but they've got more firepower than we expected." As if to emphasize his point, a tremendous boom shook the building, the unmistakable sound of a small cannon or large-caliber weapon. "Good Lord!" one of the women assisting Bethany exclaimed. "What was that?" "Mountain howitzer," Walter explained. "Army surplus. They're aiming for the barricades." The fighting intensified over the next hour, with more wounded arriving steadily. Bethany worked methodically, grateful for her medical training as she extracted bullets, stitched wounds, and administered what painkillers they had available. All the while, her thoughts kept returning to Heath, wondering where he was. if he was safe. Then a commotion at the stairs, two men carrying a third between them, blood soaking through improvised bandages on his leg and side. "Put him here," Bethany directed, clearing space on one of the tables they'd set up as examination areas. As they laid the injured man down, she got her first clear look at his face. "Heath," she whispered, her heart seeming to stop momentarily before racing into overdrive. He was conscious, his face gray with pain but his eyes alert. "Just a scratch," he managed through clenched teeth. "Took a piece of shrapnel when the howitzer hit the bank building," one of the men explained. "Got a bullet graze on his leg too. Still managed to take out the cannon crew before he'd let us bring him in." Bethany cut away Heath's blood-soaked shirt, revealing a jagged wound along his right side where metal had torn through flesh. It was deep but had missed vital organs. The leg wound was indeed just a graze, though it bled freely. "You've been lucky," she told him, trying to keep her voice professional despite the fear coursing through her. "Don't feel particularly lucky at the moment," Heath grimaced as she began cleaning the wounds. "The battle?" she asked, working quickly to staunch the bleeding. "Turning in our favor. Barton's men didn't expect such resistance. They're pulling back." He tried to sit up. "I need to get back out there." Bethany pressed him firmly back onto the table. "You're not going anywhere until I've stopped this bleeding and stitched you up." To her surprise, Heath subsided without further argument, watching her with an intensity that made her hands tremble slightly. She forced herself to focus on the task, her fingers gentle but sure as she worked. "You're good at this," he observed quietly. "I assisted our family physician back in Boston. He believed women made better healers than men." Bethany tied off a suture with practiced ease, less eager to amputate at the first sign of infection. A faint smile touched Heath's lips. "Smart man." When she'd finished with the wounds and bandaged them securely, Bethany helped Heath sit up. He moved gingerly but with determination. "Now can I go?" he asked, though there was something in his tone that hadn't been there before, a warmth that belied his gruff words. "Only if someone helps you. You've lost blood, and those stitches will tear if you're not careful." Heath nodded, accepting her conditions with surprising grace. As one of the men who'd brought him in stepped forward to assist, the church bell above began to ring, not the urgent warning toll of before, but a sustained, joyous peal. "Victory," Heath said, a complex mixture of emotions crossing his face. "Barton's men are retreating." The celebration that swept through Cottonwood Springs that evening was tempered by grief for the 3 townsmen who died defending their home, but buoyed by news that a territorial marshal was on his way with reinforcements, having been alerted by a rider Heath had dispatched before the battle. Bethany spent the evening moving among the wounded, checking bandages and administering medicine. It was near midnight when she finally stepped outside the church, exhausted but satisfied with her work. The night air was cool against her face, carrying away some of the day's tension. "You should rest," a familiar voice said from the shadows of the church porch. Heath stepped forward, moving stiffly but under his own power. He'd changed into a clean shirt, though he still looked pale in the moonlight. "I could say the same to you," Bethany replied. "Those stitches need time to heal." "I will. Soon." He moved closer, stopping an arm's length away. "I wanted to thank you for today, for staying." "You're welcome, though I still maintain it wasn't a choice, it was a duty." Heath nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Duty," he repeated softly. "I've lived by that word for so long. Duty to country, duty to memory." He looked up at the star-strewn sky. "After I lost my wife and daughter, I thought my only remaining duty was to honor their memory by existing, not living, just continuing." Bethany remained silent, sensing he needed to speak these words that had perhaps never been voiced aloud. "When I saw you that first day, standing so brave despite the danger. Something stirred in me that I thought was long dead. Heath's gaze returned to her face, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. And it terrified me. Why? Bethany asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because feeling again, caring again. It means risking loss again. His voice roughened. And I wasn't sure I could survive that a second time. Heart hammering in her chest, Bethany took a step closer to him. And now, Heath's hand rose slowly, hesitantly, until his fingertips just barely touched her cheek. Bethany felt the slight tremor in them, saw the vulnerability and wonder in his eyes that belied his strong exterior. Now I think that not risking it would be the greater loss, he said, his voice low and certain despite the trembling of his hand. His calloused fingers traced the line of her jaw with exquisite gentleness, as if she were something precious and fragile. Bethany leaned into his touch, her own hand rising to cover his. I'm not fragile, Heath, and neither is what I feel for you. Something like wonder crossed his face. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down until his lips met hers in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened with shared need and awakening hope. When they finally parted, Heath rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. I never thought I'd feel this way again, he confessed quietly. Neither did I, Bethany admitted, thinking of the loneliness that had driven her west, the empty future she'd faced in Boston after her parents' deaths. It seems we both found something we weren't looking for. Heath smiled, then a real smile that transformed his face, erasing years of grief and solitude. Something better. Much better, she agreed, drawing him down for another kiss under the vast Wyoming sky that had brought them together. In the months that followed, Cottonwood Springs underwent a transformation. With Wiley Barton arrested by the territorial marshal and awaiting trial, the town began to flourish. The railroad, freed from Barton's manipulations, negotiated fair terms with the landowners, bringing prosperity rather than destruction. Heath and Bethany were married that autumn, in a ceremony that united not just two people but seemed to symbolize the town's rebirth as well. The schoolhouse expanded to accommodate the growing number of families moving to the area, with Bethany continuing as teacher while also helping Heath manage his ranch, which was thriving under their joint care. On their first anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their ranch house watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and crimson, Heath took Bethany's hand in his. Do you ever regret it? He asked. Coming west? Staying in Cottonwood Springs? Marrying a broken-down cowboy? Bethany smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. Not for a single moment, though I take issue with the broken-down part. Heath chuckled, the sound still new enough to delight her every time she heard it. Fair enough. What about you? She asked. Any regrets? He was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. Only that I wasted so much time believing my heart was dead and buried with my past. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a tenderness that still took her breath away. When all along, it was just waiting for you to awaken it. As the last light faded from the sky, Heath drew Bethany into his arms, his hands steady and sure as they held her close, the trembling long gone, replaced by the certainty of a love neither had expected to find, but both had discovered was worth fighting for.